Are any of these statements true for you? The way I receive compliments most closely resembles this scene from The Matrix. Oh, you think I did a good job ducking that? Oh, you're proud of me? Definitely ducking that. You love me? When I have a quiet moment to myself, the thoughts that bubble up for me are not of the times I showed vulnerability or humility or grace. They're like the time I felt I was a little bit too awkward with that grocery store clerk in 1997. If I said out loud to anyone else what I say internally to myself sometimes, I would probably be arrested. And isn't it kind of messed up that in court, we can respectfully hear from two sides, but internally, on my own, it often feels like I'm really only hearing from one side, myself. And not only are all those statements true for me, as a therapist, I am also expected to know what to do about them. And I do know, kind of. And I will tell you to the best of my ability. But I will also tell you that while it is doable to tame our self-critic, the doing is not always easy, even for your therapist. Your self-critic is not yourself. That's the main thing to know. That's our starting place. And it sounds obvious because it's right there in the title, self-critic. Something separate from you that is critical of you, like a heckler criticizing a comedian or like a troll in a comment section. But when we are in an internal tornado of self-criticism, it does not feel like the critic is separate from the self. It feels like there's no buffer when that's happening. It's just what's happening. Our critic is what it feels like we are in that moment, and that's why it fucking sucks. We're ugly or failures or worthless or one of our earlobes is slightly bigger than the other. And oh my God, I think somebody just noticed and they're never gonna talk to me again. In those moments, our inner critic has a megaphone and our self is like the low talker from Seinfeld.
What's that?
Excuse me?
What's worse is we can actually convince ourselves that we need the critic.
You complete me.
We say to ourselves stuff like, if I weren't constantly telling myself I were ugly, I would probably never go to the gym. If I don't tattoo on my inner eyelids the nastiest thing my ex ever said to me during our biggest fight, I'll probably never find love. And the trouble is that this kind of self-talk can actually put us in motion. But it puts us in motion the same way dirty gasoline puts a Ferrari in motion. Yeah, the car will run, but the dirty fuel erodes the engine. That is why differentiating between our critic and ourself is an essential first step. If we don't get good at this, our critic and ourself stay tangled up all too often. And we then mistake who we are for the worst thing that's ever been said about us, and we internalize that shit. I think Freud said something like, our self-critic is but the residue of the voices of our haters. Okay, I think he actually said our conscience is the residue of the voices of our parents, but I contemporized it. A tool that I have found helpful is to imagine a day in my life like it's a movie script. You could pretend that it's a journal or something else, but a movie script is probably more fun. And as I'm reading the script of a day in my life, I'm holding a red marker and a yellow highlighter. The red marker is my critic. It wants to strike out my regrets and circle my shames and fix my spelling mistakes. The yellow highlighter is myself. It wants to point out what I should feel proud of and grateful for, and it wants to help me remember my friends' birthdays. I can sometimes be really bad with birthdays, and my fucking critic has a field day with that. It doesn't have to be perfect, but reflecting on our day like this can help us differentiate the perspective from which we're looking at different events of our lives. And with practice, we can better hold this differentiation between critic and self in real time, which doesn't mean that we toss out our red marker. That's not possible. But it does mean that we can become more aware of when we're using our red marker, which causes us to be more curious about why we're using it. But this is all still fairly heady stuff, and the critic doesn't just live in our head. It exists in our body as well, which means a full answer as to how we work with the critic can't just come from our head, it has to come from our body too. Nobody is born with a self-critic. There are 0 babies in the world sitting around going,
You idiot. You've only met 3 people in this world. You've already shit on 2 of them. You're never going to own your own home.
Self-criticism and shame are absorbed socially. They are often very young parts, which means they are parts of ourselves that remember our early emotional responses to criticism from important people like parents and caregivers. And now we talk to ourselves similarly because it's the oldest way we know how to get ourselves to behave. So what if we started to consider our critic from that perspective? that beneath our critical looping thoughts, there are some old emotions being exercised, and that they mean well, but that they know no other way. So they keep grinding away at us, pushing and prodding and pointing shit out. But if we stop for a second, and if we asked our critic how they are doing, they would probably say they're exhausted, and they would probably be glad we asked. And in the same way, it would take a minute for an exhausted athlete to respond if we asked them how they're doing after a match. Getting an answer from our inner critic may not happen right away, and that's okay. But by understanding that our self is not our critic, and by holding this separation, and by asking the body, not the brain, we usually learn from our critic that it does not believe it's our critic at all. It believes it is our protector. And realizing this is like when you're a kid on the playground and another kid comes at you and kicks you in the shin, and you're like, what the fuck? And then later you realize that they actually have a crush on you, and you're like,
I think life is going to be a bit more complicated than I first expected.
And once we start viewing and feeling all this critic stuff through a reframed lens of protection, then it tends to tune us into a more self-compassionate frequency. And it also begs the question, what is my protector protecting? And it all depends on the individual, but this part, the unpacking what our protector might be protecting, this part can require a little more support. Sometimes that's because it can be a little overwhelming, but sometimes it just helps to have somebody like a counselor guide you through it so you can just focus on your own process. I will talk about the protector more in future videos. You can click somewhere here to watch past videos, but most of all, I hope you found this video useful and fun.